England has long had laws to protect its citizens, to punish those who commit a crime, with severe punishments such as execution for the most heinous crimes of all. But in the 17th century, there was an earl who would flaunt these laws, as he got away not once, but twice, with murder. Philip Herbert was born into luxury and wealth around 1652. The son of Philip Herbert Sr., the 5th Earl of Pembroke. He was the eldest son of his father's second marriage to Catherine Villiers, with one older half-brother from his father's first marriage, William Herbert. He was born at Wilton House, the opulent country home of the Earls of Pembroke since the dissolution of the monasteries, near Salisbury in Wiltshire. He was descended from a noble lineage. His father was MP for Wiltshire and Glamorgan at different times. His grandfather, the 4th Earl of Pembroke, was a favourite of James I and a member of his Privy Council, and his step-grandmother, Lady Anne Clifford, was a formidable woman who owned estates and titles in her own right. Philip's childhood would have been a pleasant one compared to that of poorer children in the 17th century. Child mortality was high, and even if someone made it to adulthood, there was still poverty, disease, and the ruins of alcohol to cope with. Philip would still have had to survive the usual childhood diseases, but would not have been expected to work from a young age, unlike poorer children. He would have likely been taught education by a private tutor, rather than attending a grammar school like sons of the gentry. Philip would also have learned horse riding, fencing, and proper etiquette, alongside more academic subjects. In 1661, he was appointed as a Knight, Order of the Bath, when he was around 9 years old. He was not the eldest of his father's sons, so would not have been considered as the Earl in training. That instead went to William, his elder half-brother. William would have been expected to possibly go to Cambridge or Oxford when older, and at the age of 17 he travelled abroad, presumably to expand his education and experience of the world. Philip might have been expected to have a military career, as was common for younger noble sons who would not inherit their father's titles. But on the 8th of July 1674, his elder brother William died in his early 30s, leaving his titles and lands to Philip, who became the 7th Earl of Pembroke and Earl of Montgomery at the young age of 22. He then followed on from this by marrying in the same year, on the 17th of December. His new bride was Henrietta du Querouaille, the sister of one of Charles II's many mistresses, Louise du Querouaille. The sisters came from a noble family in Brittany, but not as much is known about Henrietta as her more famous sister. They had one daughter, born a few years after their marriage around 1676, named Charlotte. She would be Philip's only child. So far, everything seemed ideal for a noble family setup. The Earl was now lord of his family estates, keeper of the rolls, or custos rotalorum, of Pembrokeshire, Glamorgan, and later Wiltshire, as well as being Lord Lieutenant of Wiltshire. He had a beautiful wife and a baby daughter, but Philip had also inherited something else from his grandfather, mental instability and a violent temper to go with it. His unprovoked attacks of violence began while he was still a teenager, especially when he would get drunk. His grandfather, the 4th Earl of Pembroke, had also been known for unprovoked attacks on his peers when angry. But Philip's tendencies were more violent and unchecked than even his grandfather's, and he was found guilty of several assaults after becoming Earl. In 1677, he was in a duel with a Mr. Vaughan and nearly killed him. While duelling had not yet been outlawed, it was becoming less fashionable, and those taking part could still be arrested for murder, manslaughter, or assault. On the 28th of January 1678, the House of Lords was informed by the Lord Chancellor that Pembroke had been committed to the Tower of London by Charles II for uttering such horrid and blasphemous words and other actions proved upon oath as are not fit to be repeated in any Christian assembly. This came with the specific charge of abuse of the sacrament of the celebration of the Lord's Supper. While we have no record of what was actually said, Charles II was known to be a very laid-back and lenient king, so it must have been fairly shocking to be placed in the Tower. Luckily for Philip, he didn't have to suffer the conditions of the infamous prison for long, as he submitted a petition to his fellow peers, assuring them that he had never committed the crime, and they would not believe the accusation, or your petitioner capable of so horrid a crime. Despite the king himself having placed Philip in prison, the Lords all agreed to petition Charles II for the Earl's release, with the exception of 7 bishops, Lord Berkeley and the Duke of York all dissenting. Charles II granted Philip's release just 2 days later, on the 30th of January. But it seemed that the Earl of Pembroke had learned very little from his brief stint inside, as just a few days later, on the 5th of February, he was accused of assault by a Philip Rycote. He held that Philip had assaulted him on the Strand while visiting a friend, which was becoming a fashionable area for aristocracy, not somewhere you might expect to be beaten up. While he was leaving his friend's house, Rycote was attacked by Pembroke with no provocation, and the Earl proceeded to punch him in the face before wrestling him to the ground. The Earl even pulled out his sword, but Rycote managed to get free and back inside his friend's house before anything further happened. The House of Lords ordered the Earl to pay a £2,000 fine. That's around £320,000 today, known as a recognisance. A recognisance was a monetary pledge that someone would keep the peace or forfeit the money. But Philip appeared to be on a rampage and had already committed a far worse crime, his first murder. On the 4th of February, a man named Nathaniel Coney was drinking in a Haymarket tavern. Unfortunately for him, Philip Herbert also came into the tavern for a drink. We don't know some of the finer details. Was the Earl drunk? Was he in one of his famous furious tempers? Had he received some slight or bad news? What we do know is that again he attacked a man unprovoked. The Earl hit out viciously at Nathaniel, striking him with his right fist and continuing to punch him. Nathaniel, of course, tried to defend himself, but by this point had landed on the floor and was probably intoxicated enough that it was difficult to hit back squarely. Philip continued punching Nathaniel for some time before the poor man lay prostrate on the ground, but still the Earl carried on, now kicking him viciously. At the Earl's trial, Nathaniel Coney was revealed to have injuries and horrific bruising on his head, neck, chest, stomach, sides, and back. It was the vicious and unchecked attack of a madman. Coney was immediately taken away while the Earl was arrested and placed under medical care, but just a few days later, on the 10th of February, he died of his injuries. A Middlesex grand jury found the Earl guilty of murder just a week later, with vast amounts of evidence and over 18 witnesses who had seen the attack testifying to the crime. But on the 4th of April 1678, after another petition from Philip Herbert, he was given a trial by his peers in the House of Lords. Until the early 20th century, peers in the United Kingdom had the right to ask to be tried not by a jury of ordinary citizens, such as the grand jury in Middlesex had been made up of, but by a jury of other aristocratic peers. It was a mixed vote. 6 found him guilty of the obvious charge of murder, 18 peers unbelievably found him not guilty, and the remaining 40 found him only guilty of manslaughter. But while this may have seemed like the end of Philip's freedom, he had one last trick up his blood-soaked sleeve. He pleaded successfully for privilege of peerage. This was a legal privilege that allowed British peers the right to escape any punishment at all for their first convicted offence. While this was probably first brought in to allow peers to escape petty crimes, it was now used to escape punishment for manslaughter, as he had been charged with. The Lord High Steward, the Duke of Ormond, who presided over the trial, gave the Earl a stark warning that no man could have the benefit of that statute but once. But as usual, the Earl gave this advice little heed, as in late 1678 he attacked a fellow peer, Charles Sackville, the Earl of Dorset. He was involved at the time in a lawsuit with him, and Sackville, reportedly, narrowly escaped with his life. It wasn't long before the Earl of Pembroke's name would again be connected with a crime, this time with far-reaching implications. On the 17th of October 1678, Sir Edmund Godfrey, a man who had been the foreman of the Middlesex Grand Jury which had found Philip Herbert guilty of murdering Nathaniel Coney, was himself found dead. His body was found in a ditch on Primrose Hill, a large chase belonging to the Crown at that time, showing signs of being strangled to death before he was impaled with his own sword. There were no signs of bleeding from the sword wound, suggesting he had been dead for several days beforehand. There were no signs of a struggle, and he still had his money and rings about his person, suggesting the killing had not been for financial gain. He had also been missing for several days before, from the 12th of October, and his unexpected death and failure to find out who the murderer was caused a wave of anti-Catholic feeling, sparking the Popish Plot. Was it possible that Philip Herbert had held on to his ill feeling about the man who tried to convict him for murder before killing Sir Godfrey several months later? The Earl of Pembroke, with his earlier bouts of insanity and rage and previous escaped conviction for killing a man, makes a likely suspect, but his pattern always seemed to be a sudden and unprovoked attack, and Godfrey's murder was clearly a premeditated and thought-out killing, and it would have been difficult to hide Sir Godfrey for 5 days without any servants seeing. Could there be another explanation? The Popish Plot had really begun earlier that year, at least before August 1678. Titus Oates, an English priest, and Israel Tongue, a clergyman who was widely known to be fanatically anti-Catholic and presumed insane, invented a fictitious plot that Catholics were planning to assassinate Charles II. They had already managed to convince the king to meet with them for their accusations, and Titus Oates had also convinced the Privy Council of the certainty of their claims. Just before his meeting with the Privy Council, Titus Oates was summoned before a magistrate on the 6th of September to swear an oath to his testimony before the king. That magistrate was none other than Sir Edmund Godfrey. In his testimony, Oates swore he had been to a Jesuit meeting at a tavern in the Strand, at which various methods of killing the king were discussed. Is it possible that Godfrey had doubts about Oates' oath and testimony, or that he had discovered holes in it? When Sir Edmund Godfrey was found dead, Oates leapt upon it. Godfrey was not only a member of Parliament, but a well-known supporter of Protestantism. His death gave credence to the plot being true, and hysteria followed. Attempts to solve the murder were made, and an associate of Oates, William Bedloe, suggested it had been a young Catholic silversmith named Miles Prance. Under torture, Prance in turn denounced 3 men, Henry Berry, Robert Green and Lawrence Hill, who were a baker, butcher and farrier respectively. They were tried, convicted of the murder and executed in February 1679. But it soon became clear that Prance, under the subjection of torture, had simply named 3 men who either he held a grudge against, or the first 3 fellow Catholics who came to mind, to make the hideous torture stop. The 3 men tried of Godfrey's murder were innocent, and the real killer was free. While this is all conjecture, and the crime today is considered by most historians to be unsolvable, it makes more sense that Sir Edmund Godfrey was murdered by Oates and his associates than the Earl of Pembroke. While the Earl of Pembroke may have held a grudge, premeditated murder was not his style, and Titus Oates and Israel Tongue had much to gain from Godfrey's death to provide proof of their plot being true. The fact that Godfrey was connected to Oates and Tongue as the magistrate taking their oath and testimony was also interesting. When the 2 men came before him, he asked to see the papers they had presented as supposed proof to the plot before he would take their oath. Within the papers, Edward Coleman, a Catholic courtier, was implicated. He would later be charged with treason and executed, but Godfrey tried to warn him about the accusations against him beforehand. Perhaps Godfrey had become a threat, as well as his death being a plausible way to gain trust in their plot. Others have suggested suicide, but the marks on Godfrey's neck should have been higher if he had hung himself. One historian has suggested Sir Godfrey committed suicide, then his brothers tried to cover this up by inventing his murder in order to maintain his estates and not bring shame on the family. Other suggestions are that the Earl of Pembroke could have been involved with the killing, if not the plotting of it. He himself was Protestant, but his wife, like her sister, was Catholic. Was there some connection, where perhaps his family had been threatened if he didn't follow on the orders of the plotters? It seems unlikely, given his temperament, that the Earl of Pembroke would have given in to threats. Indeed, more likely is the possibility of him attacking those who threatened him. A further suggestion has been made that Sir Godfrey was in fact killed by an unnamed man, who was a poor enough citizen that his name wouldn't even come up in suggestion. One who had been convicted in the past, perhaps, by Godfrey for some crime. Philip Herbert had a motive to kill Godfrey in the sense that he may have had ill feeling towards him, but he did not have anything to gain by his death, as others did. Whether or not Pembroke was a suspect, he certainly once again was brought up on yet another murder charge. On the 18th of August, 1680, the Earl struck again. This time, he killed an officer of the watch, William Smeeth. The Earl of Pembroke had been out drinking at a tavern at Turnham Green, an area of Chiswick. Once again, the attack was an unprovoked frenzy on a man who had done nothing to warrant it, and like Nathaniel Coney before him, William Smeeth died of his injuries. This was the second time the Earl of Pembroke was brought up before the Middlesex Grand Jury, and on the 21st of June, 1681, he was indicted with murder. This time, Philip Herbert couldn't use the get-out-of-jail-free card of privilege of peerage, and he fled the country instead. Incredibly, this time, 24 of his peers signed a petition to the king to pardon the Earl. The reasons why so many of Philip Herbert's peers would want to help him once more cheat justice for so heinous a crime are uncertain, but even more incredibly, Charles II actually granted him a royal pardon. What the families of the murdered men thought of this lack of justice is also unrecorded, but it certainly comes across as a complete disdain for the value of life for poorer people in society. But while Charles II had given Philip a pardon, he was also banished from court and sent to remain at Wilton House. However, while the 7th Earl of Pembroke had escaped prison or even execution on a number of occasions, he could not escape death. On the 29th of August, 1683, Philip Herbert died at the young age of 30. It's not known how he actually died, but 30 was fairly young even in the late 17th century, where someone could expect to live to around 50 years old if they survived to adulthood. It suggests possibly that he died of an illness or disease which were rife at the time. Certainly if he had died through more nefarious means, we might expect some sort of information about it. His body was buried at Salisbury Cathedral on the 10th of September, and he was succeeded by his younger brother Thomas, who seems to have been a much calmer person who didn't invite controversy into his life. Philip Herbert certainly made his mark on the world, although not in a way most people would be proud of. Whether or not he really was involved in the Popish Plot, the Earl got away with murder at least twice, and showed a disregard for law and human life that was shocking both at the time and now. One thing that can be agreed upon is that he certainly earned his nickname of the infamous Earl of Pembroke. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.